Oh, yeah. Okay,
Good morning, everyone.
yeah, right,
Fair
right.
amount to do, but I think we've done a lot of work to get us here, so we should have a good discussion. And I sent out, what I sent out wasn't meant to be limiting relative to what we do, what we recommend, but sort of what in my notes from the discussion sort of came out that we should discuss. We can add some things. Steve pointed out he couldn't be here today, and he had actually I thought some really good comments from the church. You guys have a sense of what I'd like to do is what we try to do today is get our hands as best we can about what we think the recommendations are. The county staff would have put them together. We'll get them back out. I mean, I have a smaller group that does the wordsmithing on things, but I think what we'd like to do in the next day or two is get the recommendations, sort of a draft out to everyone, and ask that you quickly, if there's comments or things you want to say, you turn it back, and then I'll have a smaller group as I did last year that take that and wordsmith it into what I'll consider a final draft that will then circle back out to you. And that should get us to where we need to be. That sound okay? Okay, so Josh in here today, he had a legal emergency. He was trying to keep up with Nina. And so, but I'm going to give him a call later today or tomorrow and bring him up to speed. So let's start with really the two key recommendations in terms of financial. And I want to hit those first. And one is the recommendation of borrowing level. And what I had asked when we did the presentation on that, and I want to go back to it, is to take a look at the 85, 90, 95, and 100 million levels. And I think what we're focused on is the impact relative to downstream. The issues that the county seems to be facing, if you look at it, really are operating expenses, the growth of it, operating expenses and the limitations to that growth relative to what we see happening in the county. And the second is then the borrowing impacts that, because the more borrowing we do, stresses that even further. And that's, and so that as we look at this, an adjunct to this recommendation probably will offset into how do we deal with the existing bonds that we talked about last time that are out there, that maybe need to get more rigorous look to, what we call reauthorizing?
Not reauthorizing. Well, yeah, I guess we're reauthorizing. Yeah, reauthorizing.
But so to take it away from it sounded like that it's become perfunctory, that it's just reauthorized, and to take that out of the norm and have like it would be if we're running a business, you have something in capital when it comes up, it's still retested. It isn't because you had it in there in a 3 or 4 year plan, whatever, that when it comes up you just say, okay, that's what we we're going to spend it. You reset it against the world that you're in the environment that you're in. And that would be a sort of a secondary part of that CIP.
Yeah, and that part of it could be part of the recommendation.
Yes. Yeah, because if in the long run, if you did that, it may have a good influence relative to how you might borrow. So let me open it to the floor on your thoughts on what it should be. I've gotten Steve Poignat's comments because he isn't here. I certainly have my own thoughts, but I'm more interested right now what yours are.
This is all, Steve, this is all a baseline on the revenue that was estimated by the group at the normal growth revenue.
Right.
Correct.
And this, so if it was a higher revenue, then these numbers would be more attractive. And if there's a lower revenue, a slowdown, these things would accelerate sooner.
Yes.
Yeah. And I'll just.
There's no question there, I'm just
No.
throwing out the obvious.
That revenue growth rate, how was 3%?
It's about 3.5 to 3.7.
Now, question on that, is that, Is that an aggressive estimate? Is that a conservative estimate?
It's,
Somewhere in the middle?
it's somewhere in the middle, it's lower than historical average, but it's, kind of showing some recovery from last year's relatively weak performance on that. And we're really confident because the personal income already started to show some recovery. And going forward, I think we have moderate growth, 3 point something, it's a moderate growth. And it's also very much like what we discussed last year, it's not changed too much at all, it's 0.1% difference.
So it'd be safe to say that it might be a little bit better, but the chances of the bottom totally falling out are slim? Just for the purposes of our thinking here.
I think there's always risk, it's hard to tell, but I think the projection currently, we are comfortable for that quantum. And it's lower than historical.
But is
If you
it,
go back last time.
is it a sort of a straight line between
No, we're looking at all those different company revenue, property tax, income tax, fees, etc. Some are just flat, some are the property tax, we kind of know this as well base recovery. Because the county, the state has a phase in, and every time only reassess 1/3 of the county, so we have a reasonable guess about where likely to be. It's going to be slow but steady type of growth. Income tax based on what Dr. French said the other day, that it's going to show some recovery, not going back to the historical high level, but last year we already showed a 4% increase actual personal income tax. So we at least, I think, would be able to kick that level, maybe have a little increase. And other fees, the several, either have very little changes from year to year or like people flat, and that's everything together is 3 point something.
And I think, Steve, we're always better at, it's sort of like I look like snow removal. You got your, it's sort of cutting through, because you're never, what we can be sure is, we could be absolutely on point, but that would be the exception, that we're actually on point. It's always, and typically, in my view, it's like, in my world, the insurance marketplace or financial markets, we always can understand what happened afterwards very well. And it's usually a confluence of events, and the one outlier that, it's from my world, because I'm in real estate, at least I run the national practice for my company, is that, you know, real estate has been very hot, and there's some headwinds, I think, we're gonna see in real estate, I think, nationally. I think there's gonna be some headwinds. It's been, I think it's being refueled over the last couple of years. It's done well, but it's still relatively inexpensive money. It's fueled it, and if that changes, that has an impact relative to revenue, which has an impact on potential cap rates. So it's not anything horrible, but I don't think it's gonna be a straight line, continue the way it has been.
Yeah. And the other thing is that some of the products, I think the most difficult to anticipate is more global type of economic environment. Because at this point, you know, in general, the consensus like is not seeing very high risk for economic recession or something. But on the other hand, if you read newspapers and sometimes reasonably you talk about worries about global economic slowdown, oil price, how long it can last, the lower price, and so a lot of other things that's really out of our control. And if some of the risk, like suddenly become true in 1 year or two, that's going to change the whole picture. And interest rate also, the interest rate now start. I mean, currently it's still controlled, each up a little bit, but going forward, we don't know a year or two from now, interest rate and mortgage rate, which is going to have impact on transaction and housing market. So a lot of other factors at this point is kind of as good as, yeah, it's based on the information we know at this point. Anything beyond 2 or 3 years is really hard to tell.
Is the amount of debt that we're retiring meaningful in this all? Is it so small, because it's 30 years ago, that it's not substantial? I mean, I'm just thinking, because in terms of projected debt as a service of revenue, my intuition has always been that if you borrowed 30 years ago, it's probably not terribly significant in terms of it falling off, but are there any bumps or is there noise in there that we need to be aware of?
Yeah, I guess I'll make 2 points then. We do try to keep our debt service structure with level debt. And so we're constantly, as you look in future years, it seems as though it's tails off, but we're always trying to structure that so that our debt service payments are filling those gaps and keeping it level. Now, that doesn't speak to past, but it's speaking to the effect of the past. But the other part about this is that we've had such a run of low interest rates. We've been very aggressive over the last 6, 8 years in terms of refunding bonds. So we're taking those old bonds, we're refunding them at lower rates. The consequence is that we've extended some of the term of that older debt in order to bring it at a lower rate, a lower level of debt service. I think your general point is on, but I think those two things, those two dynamics tend to
Wash.
yeah, tend to wash.
And Mr. Poignant's comment was, this is just so, he has a voice here, he said, we should probably be around 90 million, which is what we recommended last year. Biggest points we should make are that the county needs to clear the deck of the previous approved but unused debt authorizations, and that the county should look, should be including CIP in impact to operating cost in future CIP requests. And he says part of me wants to even go lower, because he's basically saying we need to wean ourselves in sort of this habit of we're going to just keep borrowing out when we have revenues that are not going up at the same rate that we've seen historically.
So we are a recommendation committee, we're recommending 90 million last year, and the actual authorized was 99.
95.
Well, we did that, but we didn't actually
Right.
commit 80.
I know last year we had talked about, at some point, we needed to drive maybe towards 75 long-term.
I think the question is how do
Move
you
in that
get there
direction.
a little bit at a time. And
Right.
when we presented before the council, it was very interesting, because the council, my perspective, and I had Ellen, and I'm thinking Ryan was would be, my perspective is, I don't think they had gone through the 120 million the previous years. They didn't have the same perspective as we had read in the report of why it was 120 million, what we were trying to do. They just thought we can afford it, and why are we, I mean, that was my sense, why are we coming off it? And I felt like our committee has done a really good job on understanding the numbers, perhaps more so than perhaps the council overall had relative to the past process. So I think that it's part of the reason I think the county executive made sure this was independent in terms of outside the county. Well, respect to Ray was, I don't know if he's like him, but it was chaired previously, the previous couple of years, at least 1 year, by the county, which is sort of allows the county to drive what they want, and that's not our role.
So just part of your comment was there is a time to grab a hold of debt. And so I can understand why the council would say if it's affordable and if it fits within the purpose of the county and it's affordable, grab it at the lowest rates we've seen for decades for the right projects as much as you can, as long as it's affordable.
Yeah.
So there, I mean, it makes sense. It's just scary as the numbers continue to never get better.
Well, it's also scary as the counties, that's what we're looking at. That's why we have the demographics this year, telling that we're trying to get behind where the county is changing. Part of it's land, how much we have to bring commercial and to grow. You know, that's a fixed number that's there relative to what our past growth has been. The other we're seeing is some change in our job, and I don't think that's, from as I look at it, I'm not an economist, but Richie there, but I don't see that as a bad thing. I think that's just the maturing of the county. Part of it is just, you know, you're going to have job growth, but you're just not going to have the same potentially type of numbers that we saw during the 90s and 2000s relative to this county and how much growth we have left.
And that's a really critical point, because I mean, even the percentage change of revenue growth could, in reality, could be different from what we are showing here in the multi-year. But in reality is, as a county maturing, it's really hard to expect at any time, like foreseeable future, we suddenly see a really fast track type of growth. It might be seen in 1 year because of something happening there. And that's not likely to be the new norm. The new norm is more likely to be, it's still a very solid, but still relatively moderate type of growth. And that's probably better than the majority of the cities and counties in the nation. And we just have to figure out how do we deal with that and live with that and do the best service using that resource. And that's going to be reality. I think this is for a while.
Okay. Additional comments or recommendations, Roland? We've got 90 on the table. Steve put that out. Which is what we did last year.
I'm for prudence on both line 80, 90 and slow growth in spending, but I think we are going to diversify our commercial base with the real estate we got coming online, but I don't think we can plan on it. I mean, downtown Columbia, will or not, I mean, is it going to be a 20-year build-out or is it going to be a 40-year build-out? And I think the commercial base in Howard County is going to grow.
Yes.
And with Gateway coming online, but with the state slowing down, you know, again, is it a 20-year build-out, is it a 40-year build-out?
Well, but I think it's a good point, Rich. It's also why this committee meets every year. So we don't knee jerk, but we look at that fixed period of time and do the best you can within, you know, listen, I testified on downtown Columbia when people were trying to be prescriptive in terms of, we gotta have this school site here. I said, it's 30 years. The reason it's flexible is maybe someone looked at how, you know, when Columbia started in 1967, Jim thought it was gonna be a 8 to 12-year process, and it was built out. The world slightly changed, at least the US changed in that. So that's why I think that 30-year piece for a much smaller piece of Columbia was put in, because it's a reality of, think about when Columbia started in 67 and when I came in 73 to the Rouse Company, how many economic cycles occurred during that period, you know, and if it hadn't been for Connecticut General and Jim's ability to get them to really restructure and actually finance it to take them through, I think it was another 2 recessions is the way they refinanced it, we would have been like Reston and been backward.
And the other thing, what Steve and I talked about, we're exposed to a downturn because we've lost the property value gap over the, you know, the taxable versus, you know, assessed base. So, you know, I don't think anybody's predicting a downturn in the next 2 years, but it's possible with global uncertainty. So half of our tax base for the last recession kept growing because of that difference, but we've given that back.
Yes.
So we have to really be prudent, not only, you know, because of slow growth, but because of increased exposure and risk to downturn.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So if I understand, I'm sorry, if I understand the draft correctly, the percentage was 896 last year, last fiscal year, 2015, and now it's up to 942 for this year. The fiscal 16 that ends June of this year, is that right?
Yes.
So in the last year, it's moved up 0.5% compared to revenue. Done deal, June 30.
Yeah. Because FY16 is based on what's already, you know, the existing debt.
So the
So that's a real number.
the situation as a percentage got worse in the last year, and then now we're looking forward.
Yeah.
And so I'd like to see, you know, it better next year. I'd like to see a lower recommendation and then see what happened before continuing higher recommendations, just personally.
Well, on that theme, so just for the sake of completeness, I think that all the debt indicators that we're talking about are anything over $100 million, I'm going to assert that anything over $100 million looks irresponsible.
Right.
That's fine.
Right.
Do we know what the for example, the $9 million, what is that relative to the capital budget for 17?
Well, two things. First, you mean in terms of what's been asked for?
Yes.
They asked for, I think, $247 million.
That's not.
But that's based on our reality check.
We've already talked about it. And the reason why I bring it up, there was an article in the Post about the city of Alexander with their deferred maintenance. And we all know that deferred maintenance becomes more expensive maintenance.
Jim Irving
That's-
will come in and tell
It
you.
doesn't happen. Exactly.
No, you're right, and Jim, I mean, with Jim, we didn't give Jim much time, but Jim would tell us that and correctly so, and listen, it was no different in a shopping mall or an office building or anything you're dealing with. Is deferred maintenance is one of the things that's always a struggle when you're looking at your annual budget and you keep pushing certain things out and determining what you can push out and what you can't push out. But within the county, it is a big deal. We have a lot of assets, and it's one of the things historically, no matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat, it's historically one of the places it's easier to cut because you don't hear the citizens complain about that. Now, they complain about it eventually because it'll create a capital need or operating costs go up. And sometimes people don't see that if you don't do deferred maintenance, where you really pay for it is an operating cost, which is some ways a worse problem for us.
Yeah, and in reality, it is really kind of fine line to this from the county government's perspective, because when we look at the tax number, you see them as getting bigger. And also the prior slides, it's not shown here, we compare to other counties, we also at the high level, almost at all the indicators there, no matter by other counties or the state. On the other hand, the county has lots of needs, and some of this is not a sexy project, but the infrastructure, some road, and other things that really cannot delay for too long. At some point, we still have to address that. Unfortunately, at this time, it's not the best affordability time, but those issues get to a point that you have to address some of that now. And then the other projects already started in the middle of that. It really doesn't make sense to stop that. That fire already started a couple of years ago. So those also make it, you have very little flexibility. And on top of that, a lot of new requests from our education entities, from other services of the county there. That's why the need side is realistic state to say that it's still really high. Even you try to make it as close as possible to affordability, it's a challenge. That's why last year the government proposed one is close to 90, but we did everything we can, just cannot live with that 90. But I think I think the committee made a really good point in how you want to send a signal, make sure that people are aware of the issue and realistically make great efforts to address that, and that's what we're doing on that.
Yes.
But in reality, there are both part of it.
We could also look at it almost like a negotiation. Last year we said 90 and the final result was 95, 96. So if we want it to really be 90, we should probably say 85, and they're gonna push
I
back
absolutely
and get it to 90 and call it a day. So if 90 is the number we want, we should probably open the bidding at 85.
Well, I can tell you, in 95, I think, but I with Ecker, and I always say it was a lot worse situation than Executive Kittleman faced last year. I remember reading that report, we recommended no additional borrowing.
How'd that work out?
And he didn't fully accept.
Well put, Steve.
He took it under advice.
He took it.
Interesting was the word.
Yeah, exactly so.
Holly, what happens if anything, if we go over 10% by some circumstance? What occurs?
The agency could come back? Yeah, I mean, it's not gonna be well received by the rating agencies, and
But it's no default on.
it's not a default, but that number
That's
doesn't go up to 10% by itself. Going up to 10%, that has the impact on the other measures as well. And the outcome of that is that we're sending the wrong signal to the rating agencies. We already recognize we're at the high end of some of these measures, and there's a lot of forgiveness that goes with that, given the wealth of this community, the stability, the basis of our financial system, our financial conditions in the county. We don't want to push that too far.
So we could go from AAA to AA, and our borrowing costs go up, borrowing costs go up 6 basis points. What's the reality?
The reality is it could be just that. I mean, the near-term reality is that we're probably put on negative watch, and they say how concerned they are, and they're going to watch us for a year or two and see where we go. This is part of a trend where we're going to continually push up against that limit. We're headed up to see the rating.
They're really upset with us, but they're going to continue to buy our debt.
Oh, yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it's a wonderful business model, rating agencies.
Yes.
We pay them to evaluate our debt, and the investors pay them for the advice that they give them about our debt. So they're making money on both ends of this. The real issue is it goes into the financial markets. And right now, Maryland credit, Howard County credit is stellar. This makes it less than, well, we start down a road where it becomes less than stellar. And, yeah, is it a double A? Does this say triple A? We're going up to the rating agencies this weekend. We'll be meeting with them on Monday. And wish I had another week here to tell you what the outcome of that was, but I never take that for granted. I don't cruise into those rating agency meetings. I'm always worried about what might happen. Right now, the issues I'm concerned about is the level of fund balance. Moody's go-to issue for us is always fund balance, and they'd like to see more in there. Well, I'd like to see more in there too, but we have competing demands right now. I don't want to do anything that damages that AAA standing. It's important in so many dimensions.
I think part of what we do, and I think, when I read Steve's comment, part of what we do, we reduced, when we went off the smaller group, I think we left this room at 100 million, and we took it to 90 million. And it was just a gut, we had to do something to send a message of what, and I think that's, in my view, I think it's the same thing here today, and what Steve and I think what you said, the 85 million, we're really sending a message that we're trying to do it to the county, to both the county executive and to the council, that we need to over time reframe our view of where we are. We can't live in it's sort of like we can't live in the past in terms of how things were. We gotta live where we are, and if things change dramatically, if all the metrics that we're seeing in terms of growth, how much growth is available in the county and downtown change, then we can do it, but let's do it not on hope, but on reality of what we see in the numbers. I think that's sort of our message.
Steve, this is probably the most difficult decision this group has to make. And Jim Urban might come in and speak to deferred maintenance, but Holly and I could equally speak to that $240 million request that we get in the capital program. Now, so much of that is probably it's great, but we do know how great the needs are in this county. And in so many ways, we are kicking the can down the road, particularly in terms of county facilities. But we can't spend what we don't have. And so it's the balance between trying to be able to fund our programmatic needs and our capital asset needs and at the same time be responsible. I can't argue for a higher debt level. I'm still in somewhat shell-shocked from what happened in last year with the income tax receipts that came in November of 14. We were surprised. That caught us by surprise. In my heart of heart, I want to believe that a very positive recovery is underway in Howard County. Dr. Clinch, I think it's still too soon to tell. I mean, it's frightening to not know what yet what's the next step? What's the next shoe going to fall? I think it's too soon for us to be comfortable.
I think if we were to look down to Annapolis and see what happened when they went from, we got it under control to a $645 million structure, it was based on some thought process. I can get in the heads of our delegates and senators that we're going to be back to the way we were, and we'll spend as if we were going back to the way we were. And you know, I asked a good friend of mine who's a lobbyist and a Duke guy. But we will probably get, we don't probably agree on a lot of things in terms of economics, but I asked him, so what happened? Yeah, and then he didn't answer the question. He didn't answer the question because the good news in here, none of us are running for anything. Well, I got a school. With a minor exception.
Yes, it's only 60+% of the budget.
That's right. So our job, and I think it's the same as, remember we started at the beginning, this is our house. We're making decisions that are reasonable as if it's our house and we had to make it for ourselves, and that's.
The important thing to note here, I think, too, is that it's a political decision about whether or not money is spent, how the money is spent. Our job is to give a recommendation on what we can afford to borrow.
You're not telling where it goes.
And extending the analog, like personal finance, when I have a millennial come in and tell me he needs a raise because he wants a nicer car, how you choose to spend your money is none of my business. And if you want a raise, you have to create the underlying value. And I'm thought of that here. If we're gonna borrow more money, the fundamentals need to say it. If we can't talk to the needs, we have to talk to the fundamentals.
So this chart has framed some of the conversation, and as Brian said, over 100 looks, again, unsustainable, but there's nothing, no reason why you can't talk about 80 as opposed to how this thing is framed at 85.
I guess the question would be, what would the ramifications be of 80? Are you talking 9.01 to 8.99? You know, is it some negligible drop, or is it a significant enough drop that you really want to take a look at it?
Probably 8.85.
There's no reason.
If you look at it on the, if you look on the street.
There's no reason to spend any money.
My sense would be, and it's not that I'm in the baby steps, and we took them down 10 million last year we took them down from what we originally thought. We took them down 30 million from where they had been.
Yeah.
But there was all the reality justification of that, because that was, in theory, a short-term bump.
I think historically, we've long flirted around 9%. We're looking at 8.96 for the current year, but it's always been around 9%. I should say, in my tenure, it's always been around 9%. So if we went back and looked at last year, I'd have to verify that. But 85 cents is a strong message. Yeah, we do need to bring it down.
And I think while we're not in the politics, it gives them a chance to think it through, you know, versus us cutting the weeds. Very comfortable with that, and I think within that policy, if you can craft a language, we talked about just two things that we probably want to get down in some senses. One is looking at the previously authorized bonds, okay, and having a systematic approach to looking at that, so we know what we really have, and that they be basically go through the same strenuous, basically evaluation relative to need and et cetera. And then two is that the capital plan, that there be, I don't know how to word this, but that there be some more structure to that 5-year capital plan, that it's more realistic, that it in the J curve.
Well, and that drives the borrowing authorization or reauthorization process.
Right.
Because if a cap project sits there in perpetuity, you're gonna reauthorize bonds in anticipation, but if that CIP starts to get smaller in the out years, then it's easier to sort of deauthorize or not further authorize bonds.
And I would tell you, because when we did that, that was our first meeting, and I asked Holly to put those numbers together. It surprised me, because 15 years ago when I did this, it was just the opposite. It was still high in the first year, but it was always high in the first year and nothing in the backside. It was always making the case, well, if you just get us this now, everything will be okay. And it was never. And so it sort of flipped it the other way.
So part of this about beyond the immediate history of the next several years, similar approach.
We need to take a similar conservative approach to borrowing, and we need to get a more consistent and accurate, if you will, reality check in terms of the 5-year.
Can you give us a soundbite on why that jump happened? That's not clear to me.
Yeah, that's,
Like,
is that all 120, or is that?
if somebody asks me a question, what's different? Like, well, we borrowed 90 million last year, and that's a 50 basis point increase.
I think it may be because of the revenue itself did not grow as much in the past year. So we're looking at the borrowing level. We'd already, even though we recommended 90 last year, we're still looking at the momentum from prior years borrowing at around $100 million. What really changed there was the revenue basis by which we're measuring that.
Isn't there a delay, like we say
Yeah.
90, and then it
Yes.
takes forever for those things? That's the
Well, it
authorized.
That's
does.
part of that too.
We're getting ready to issue 82.4 this year, right? So the recommendation of the committee is for, last year was for 90, but the projects that we're looking at were authorized not just last year, but in several prior years.
Right.
Some of those projects were probably part of a $100 million prior recommendation. They haven't caught up to us yet. There's another 18 million, if you will.
Yes, and that's the hard part.
That's the hard part.
But what's-
Because the 120 and all the things we did those other years really is what got us.
Well, it's all, I'm sorry, it's also what, what I think I'm going back to what Steve Quinn had said, is we should be focused so much more on the operating cost, because what you have, if that's paring down, if that's leveling out, then it really impacts how these numbers in the out years are. So we can't just look at borrowing and look at, they're connected relative to our ability. I mean, that's the reality check in terms of I call it a new norm, and trying to make decisions on where we can spend our money, and wide range of things. We spent, I'll just pick something I like a lot, because I love it out here, but the parks. We've spent a lot of money on parks in the last 5, whatever years. So the kind of decisions we make when you have education, library, college, safety, you're gonna look at these things and say, we're a small county, how much is enough relative to quality of life, and where we have to really constrain. And again, this is the same way your example, do you get a new car? Or you get something, or maybe you get a new car, but you don't get a BMW.
I also am concerned then with that answer that, is that my intuition based on looking at the scraps that the out years are based on advertising the debt that we're talking about incurring today, not looking at the details from prior years. So do we know, for instance, that if we recommended and the council approved 0, that we still wouldn't have an increase because we're still dealing with the time gap or whatever we're gonna.
Yeah, I think that's the tricky part, because it's really hard for us to guess, because as Nikki mentioned last time, there was a large amount of prior authorized amount they are not issued yet. Even after the very tedious exercise, after some time, we might figure out a small portion of them no longer needed. The rest of them might still be needed there, so, but the timing it's hard to tell how much, this model is a really simplified one, and try to say, okay, how much you authorize, this is how much you issue. In reality, what you authorize took a while to transfer the issuance, and then compound with what the prior years
But he knows, right?
go back to several years there.
He's going for more coffee.
Because if we're already, if based on prior authorizations, we're already committed to an 11% increase, we just don't know it yet, then boy, that's a very different question.
You say committed, we have reauthorized those projects, but there still has to be a conscientious decision made each year to the county executive as to which projects are going to be in the current year. Alan sent a signal to, not sent a signal, he said in a certain terms, he wants that capital program cleaned up, he wants to look at that out year spending and determine which of those projects are viable, which of those projects we just keep pushing down the road. So we've got to get that part cleaned up. Now that's future spending, but it's also affects the authorization of those projects, if you will. Do they remain in, or do we say we're not going to reauthorize those projects when their authorization expires? And that's a 4-year process. I think up until the present time, and Steve, that's grown over time since you were here last, we're saying more and more capital projects have wound up in the out years. And the consequence of that is we have authorized, we've gone forward with authorization on those projects because they're in the program. Get them out of the program, those authorizations cease. Will there continue, even if there's 0 recommendation, would there be bond issues next year? Yes. Will we be bonding the projects that we need, or they represent projects that, while they've been reauthorized and while they're potentially there, that Alan wants to cut them because they're projects we keep kicking down the road? I think this is a year we really need to look at cleaning up that capital program. I don't want to make it sound as terrible as it appears. This is a responsible action. Take a look at that. Don't keep misleading folks that we're going to eventually fund these projects. Don't keep misleading yourselves that we're going to eventually fund these projects. There needs to be a time where you say no. And unfortunately, I think over the experience of the last 10, 12 years is that we've not said no as often as we should.
Isn't that where the disconnect, there's a big disconnect here. It's project and needs that are authorized at various points in time, and they have lead times and then they have a lag effect, versus should not recommendation ultimately be that the county, not regardless of when the financing was authorized, should not go to the market and borrow more than X this year, regardless of when that commitment was made. I mean, to me, we should put a stake in the ground and say, the county will not go, our recommendation is the county not go to the market and borrow more than 85 million, regardless of when the project was
I hear
authorized.
what you're saying, let's balance that though, we don't borrow ahead of time, we borrow after the fact.
After that.
Right, so what we're borrowing for this year is to pay for capital project costs that were expended last year, or expended through this year. So there's $82 million that we're going to the market for.
To reimbursement.
To reimburse ourselves for project spending.
I understand that. I understand that.
Okay.
82 sounds good.
We know the number. Well done.
82,457.
Round it up to 82.5.
But I mean, that's actually, I like that recommendation, because it really puts a fence around how you should be managing it.
It begs the question too.
Right.
If we do 82,457.
Well, you know, we made, I just want
Why are we gonna,
Whoa.
why are we recommend anything more?
Yeah, excuse me, one second. I said 82,457, that's tax exempt, there's an additional $1,730,000 in taxable, so that gets us to the 85. I mean, there's
84.5.
Get me to a round number.
If we're there.
I just wanna,
I'm gonna close this, then we're
Yeah.
gonna come to a vote.
I'm amazed,
Thank you, Steve.
I also am on our APFO task force. So I'm amazed,
God bless you.
I'm amazed at the difference in this group versus that group. And,
Yeah, we need to talk about that little fee thing, you guys.
The only thing that I would throw out is that, you know, again, it's good to see the diversity and different, you know, if that group is representative of the county, there's a very strong feeling that we're not keeping up in terms of facilities. Very massive.
But they also want that all paid for
By developers, yes.
by developers.
But
I heard that would increase the price maybe $27,000 or something.
Well, there's too many numbers to really put in arms around. But I will say that as this committee recommends lower and lower debt spending, and, you know, it's not all that practical. The demands that the citizens.
Well, but at the end of the day, then that's a political question, is they want more taxes.
Right.
You know, that's not our decision, but you gotta pay for it. Whatever you're gonna do, you gotta pay for it. So if you're gonna have more taxes, you know, I think
But the thing is,
that, you know, they want it, but they want it, from what I've heard from that committee, they want it,
It's
they
like an
want
old
it.
TV commercial.
I mean, that's true for any of us, frankly.
Okay,
I really don't want it.
but that's not how, but again, our whole common sense approach is how do we work our house, and that doesn't work that way in your house.
Well, right, but I also, again, from a selfish standpoint, if that situation becomes, oh, you can't build anymore, I'm not voting for that. You know what I mean?
No, but I think that's a larger, you know, just back one second, like I said, the most important thing we do is we get the numbers right, recommendations, and then I frame it in, we need conversations.
Right.
Because we need conversations about it, because first of all, and I just heard sideways on that stuff, they don't even get the resale issue. They wanna lock it all into new construction, that there's just no reality to that, and you don't have, what's been good about this group is the openness of conversation and information that comes across versus everyone coming with a fixed position, this is the way
Right.
it's gonna be.
But one last point, okay, we made the grand bargain, as they called it in that committee, which was, okay, we're gonna have an allocation process, and therefore if we keep our housing starts at this level, we don't have to have all these other different measures. And that bargain is a great bargain. No other county has it, so don't screw the bargain up.
You're talking about the fees right now, the way they're structured already.
The bargain is that we don't have APFO tests for police and fire and all these other things, because the bargain is, if we only build 2,000 a year, or approve 2,000 a year, we're already controlling all that, and the county should be able to provide those facilities.
But the 2,000 a year is still, there's still a test on where they're built relative to.
Correct, which actually makes it less than 2,000.
It's still-
So, the offset of,
This slide shows the housing
of,
starts.
if the county's not keeping up with that bargain, then there's gonna be even more stringency as to where they can be put. So it's all playing into each other.
You're absolutely right about no other county has such a thing, or has, even we, this you're talking about a new recommendation, but even this builds on the strong advocate process that we've had here for such a long time. I've asked Holly if she could pull up the slide from our ratings presentation that shows housing starts for each of the sister counties in the vicinity over, I guess, the last 6, 8 years. And if we could take a quick look at that. Howard County was the one constant throughout that process. You see everybody going up and down, and we're constant, stable. Even in the most difficult financial conditions over the last 8 years, we've been constant. Our process for doing this has kept a cap on new housing starts, if you will. We have not put out operating, we've not incurred the additional operating costs that may come from a zigzag effect. So, I don't know if you have been able to find that.
And whether some of those members won't accept or not, if you look at, Phil did a great job on the demographics and where they're flowing into the school system, and
Right.
60-some% is from the resales.
No question of that.
And just remember also, going forward, the patterns of development that are changing are to bring in lower income people than we've had historically. Not low income, I'm not, I mean,
But lower than.
lower than the mean.
Right.
So, personal income growth in Howard County is driven by a variety of things. Attracting lots of people was one of them. Attracting lots of high income people was even better. But the shift in where we're developing is going to lead to more people. It's going to be closer or maybe even below the mean for the county. As a result, personal income growth will be suppressed by the type of development we're having compared to historically.
And typically in that type, you're gonna have more school age kids. Okay, so we get, let's put on 80, 85, and 90.
Yeah, Steve, here's our housing starts slide that we're speaking to. And Howard County, I can't read the legend there in terms of who was purple and who was green.
We are the red one.
Yeah,
Oh,
Okay.
Montgomery's purple, Prince George's is blue. The light
Just zoom on the
blue.
right down corner.
There you go. There it is.
And we never went particularly low, we never went particularly high. It zigzags a little bit, but we've been very constant through. This is one factor.
This year's we're like somewhere around 1,500.
1,500, yeah. About 1,500.
Purple's much better. We're the red. Yeah, purple's much better. Look at that. It's swanky, it's like.
Okay?
One point is that Steve, you mentioned that if you, in terms of affordability, if we add tax or something, right, change it back. But the thing is that because the overall, there are 4 debt indicators. The only one you can impact on that is the debt service divided by revenue. And that, because the overall revenue is more than $1 billion revenue. So any change, that's going to be really marginal, so the debt service number is not likely to change much at all. If if we want to improve that through enhanced revenue, it's not. The other 3 debt indicators not going to impact, this is per capita debt, and overall debt as a percentage of per capita income, outstanding debt, that's all not going to change that by changing the revenue.
And the assessable base.
One of the things on the backside, if we get through these other things that we might want to consider, and I know Steve mentioned is, should we be looking at the debt measures and saying and rehanging what we think is really appropriate for 2 measures? We got what the rating agencies do, but within that, should we be putting for, here's how we look at the county, here's what's an accurate representation of where we are in terms, because the per capita debt, which we've been, 20 years ago, we were well over.
Yeah.
We've been
That's
way
why,
over.
that's why we also have one divided by per capita income.
Because that's what they're really looking at. So that may be, the more appropriate one to put in. I don't think per capita that really matters to the rating agency. They just want to know you have the ability to tax.
The per capita income was already listed.
I I know, I understand what I'm saying, what should
It's
we?
probably more relevant for our.
Yeah, but the recommendation we're speaking to today is as much about sending a strong signal as it is about making, Holly's correct, we're not going to make a great deal of change in 1 year. It's going to be several years of lower spending, if you will, to get us there. But, you know, the message coming from the committee is that we're concerned about the trend limits. We're concerned about these debt levels, perhaps moving into a range whereby the rating agencies take a bad look at this. The rating agencies themselves are just the hall monitor, if you will. It's our behavior that we have to live with.
Well, I would say it's more important how we look at it.
Yes,
And
yes.
it's really us managing, we don't need to be managed by the rating
No,
agencies, we
no,
need to manage
but as I
ourselves.
say, it's more like there's a hall monitor. It's our behavior that's really critical.
So, 80, 85, and 90, what I've got sort of on, not the 90. In terms of the
Our
bar,
recommendation, I thought 85 was another.
80, 85, well, I haven't heard, I've heard different things, I wanna make sure.
Ryan and I are at 85.
I'm with you, that's what I put out there, but I don't wanna be driving this, so can I just show of hands, people that wanna go 8 to 80? 85? Okay. 90? Okay. That's it, we're not going 90.
110.
I knew you would be there. Okay, so we have 85 million will be our record, and then we'll wrap around that the budgeting process and the reauthorization.
And one comment, because I don't want to lose it before the end of the conversation. If we do happen to have some windfalls, we talked about, you know, cap gains or people that are now starting to take, you know, distributions out of 401k and IRA plans. I'd like to also have some language in there that goes to positive variances on the personal income level, that the county take a real strong look at what the county does with that excess. And look to build.
That also becomes fund balance. though.
Exactly. Well,
And we talk about that in PAYGO.
A subject you might want to talk about, I think it's in your framework for discussion about how do we address the.
Right, because to Stan's point earlier about the rating agencies looking at that fund balance level, and we need to start to think about, you know, the quote-unquote rainy day fund and increasing that fund balance. So if the bottom falls out 3 years from now,
So
we're not
what you're really saying is,
stressed.
where I've got PAYGO in there, is to put that as basically a discussion, PAYGO versus rainy day fund in terms of what fund balance, where it would be allocated. Okay? That's good.
And I have to add, though, that the financial discipline that the county has shown is equally a part of this. Two counties coming in and sitting down with the rating agencies and having a 9% debt to income, if you will, they can look at them differently. We have always made contributions to the rainy day fund without fail, and we have never drawn down from it. And those two verbs are those two adverbs are really important. We always have, and we never have. We've always made the required contribution, and we have never drawn down. And so we are always keeping that rainy day fund at a percent that is that by charter was determined to be an effective management backup, if you will, an effective reserve pool. Another county might come in and sit down with those rating agencies and not have that history that they've always made those contributions, or that they can't say that they've never drawn from. There's a difference between 9% and 9%, if you will. It is what kind of discipline have you shown in terms of managing your finances? And this county has a good history.
I would say that even when this county executive came in and had a 15, 16 million structure, we didn't go anywhere other than
Current revenue.
current,
Right.
current revenue. What percentage, just quickly, on a rainy day fund, what percentage of,
Rainy day fund is 7% based on the charter,
Yeah,
yeah.
based
on
on the
charter.
audited financials for the most recent ended
so
fiscal
it
year.
goes up or down based on?
Right,
Sure.
so any amount still left at the end of the year beyond that there, and some are assigned to the designated fund balance, and what is truly above the rainy day fund but can be used is will be called undesignated, unassigned fund balance there. That it is true that has been shrinking dramatically, because before, like last couple of years, before FY16 budget include $40-some million US fund balance, and that's actually at the end of FY14, that dropped to $2-some million unassigned on top of the 7%. That's very minimum. And that's last year after spending, it was making a point that even if you have fund balance beyond rainy day, instead of try to use all of them in 1 year, we should only go like half of that. Isn't
Yeah, I
that
think that's what we
maybe
recommend, is that we take,
And I think
rather
that's
than
very
just doing
solid
it.
recommendation.
It's sort of like trying, again, our snow removal fund is sort of make sure we have, because otherwise you spend it all and then we have a bad year and we can't do the friggin' roads.
Right, because the rainy day fund, it's theoretically speaking, we should try to avoid touching that at all. It's really just for unforeseeable natural disaster, like really big thing, like unexpected there. Other than that, we should have other things on top of that if we can build up there in anticipate, or if something happens, can be used as a cushion to deal with that. Besides using some of them in a controlled manner for one-time expenditure, like people for some road resurfacing or some other needs on that.
Which is why, and I'm gonna ask you to sort of take us through, what you see as the range of funding increases that we should recommend it. But it's why we wanna do it conservatively enough to, you know, you never know up or down, it's never gonna be perfect, but do it on a conservative basis, because you really do want some surplus in this thing, because if not, like we had this year, there was no resurfacing. If you continue on that basis, then then it's become an operating budget issue. Okay, it certainly shouldn't be a bonding issue, it doesn't have enough life on it to justify bonding it. So it's gonna be an operating issue, which is gonna put more stress on everything we're talking about. So, you know, you're not trying to get this just right so we can spend everything we have. You wanna have enough beyond the rainy day fund that if we're right in what we say, maybe there'll be a little extra because you need it.
We need to allocate some of that to OPEB. We didn't spend a lot of time on that this year, but we talked about it a lot in past years. I mean, if we're talking about found money, doesn't some of that have to go?
Well, the OPEB was a budget issue, that was actually, if I'm correct, that was in the operating budget?
Yes and yes.
We're all right.
No, presently, we are both appropriating money for OPEB, so it becomes a budget line item. But we are also looking at any remaining fund balance at the end of the year to make an additional contribution if possible. Now, for the prior maybe 6 or 8 years, that has been irregular. There's not always been an appropriation specifically for OPEB. It's been more opportunistic. If there was available fund balance, in addition to spending it on capital projects, there may have been a $5 or $10 million contribution to OPEB. The good news is that we finally reached a target level in our unfunded OPEB liability where our discount rate dropped, and the consequence is that our unfunded liability went from, I'm going to guess right now in rough numbers, but $750 million down to about $580 million, I believe. So that discount rate,
$500 million?
that discount rate, well, that doesn't give the whole.
I was making a joke.
We actually budget OPEB contributions for current retirees on an ongoing basis, but what we're talking about is contributions to the OPEB trust for future retirees. And we're chipping away at it.
So that problem is less of one than 3 years ago?
Yes.
Absolutely, it's much.
I withdraw, yeah.
If I recall, Richard, it's supposed to be fully funded 2021?
I believe so.
Yes, that's what we're
Yeah.
The 580 goes away in 2021?
I'm sorry?
580 goes away, the $500 million?
Well, we would hope our trust is up in that range by then, so it's, whether we can get there or not remains to be seen. But keep in mind, for folks, OPEB is other post-employment benefits. Largely, we're talking about medical benefits for retirees. And so the county has a liability for current employees and for future employees who stay the course and retire to make those medical benefits. We are making medical benefits payments today as part of the budgetary process for existing retirees. The conversation that we're having about contributions to the trust is for future retirees. For folks like me, I'll never collect on an OPEB. I won't have been with the county long enough for me to retire and get medical benefits from the county. I've been with the county 8 years. I'm going to be 65 in June, folks. It's doubtful that I will be with the county long enough to get a benefit from the retirement system. That said, I'm still counted on an actuarial basis in terms of the county's liability. So we look at what the potential liability is, and we're making contributions to the OPEB trust accordingly. Alan is committed to staying the course, if you will, in both making an appropriation each year, which is why I
Was
said
it
yes.
5 or 10 million?
I think it was 10.
10 million.
And when fund balance provides it, to make an additional contribution in that year as part of that catch-up.
And let me add, where that came up last year, we recommended that OPEB, that there be a holiday on any additional money that went in, but not on what was already planned to go in. And that's why I want to make sure we're clear on that, because the council, some members of the council misinterpreted that, and they wanted to take money out of OPEB and move it into the Board of Education, into, I think, Oakland Mills and a pay raise. It was a minor, and what I wrote to Mary Kay and to the council members said that was not our, you may have interpreted that way, that was not our intent. And our perspective was, I wrote to all the committee members at the time, was if you're gonna take money from something to do something, take something that hurts us, not your employees, which 60% of which are teachers. 66% of teachers. So we just said, if you're gonna do that, do something that we all feel, that rather, and we'll deal with it, versus doing it to our employees where we have an obligation, because that's typically kicking the can down the road and saying, we're gonna catch up. And we've seen politically, wherever it is, that just doesn't happen.
And also more costly.
I think the county's taking a responsibility, so we're gonna just, my view when we get to OPEB is just to restate that in a very nice way, so we wanna be clear about what we're doing, that we're not.
Steve, a quick comment about PAYGO. We don't budget PAYGO, pay-as-you-go funding. On a close to $1 billion, almost $2 billion budget, when we get the capital costs and everything in there, our fund balance at the end of the year is rounding error. Now, I know that might seem difficult to consider, but $15 million on a billion-plus budget is rounding error. And we did not have that benefit last year because of the income tax projections were lower than we believed, but we still had enough that we finished the year with a modest surplus. Part of that was the extraordinary actions that Alan took when he became county executive and managed. But part of that is just the way that we budget in a conservative manner as possible. We get to the end of the year, we have maybe $15 million left. We spend that on capital projects, or we spend that on an OPEB contribution. We spend that on one-time expenditures, but we don't budget for PAYGO. It's a consequence of, if you will, of the in and outs that take place during the fiscal year. I would love to be able to hit that number right on the money each year, but the fact of the matter is we can't. And $15 million really, when it comes down to it, is rounding error, and I'm glad that we have it.
Take us through your thoughts on our ability to increase funding, operating funds.
Are you still talking about fund balance?
No, we're not talking about fund balance, we're talking about what we're gonna recommend in spending.
Oh, overall spending. Okay. The overall spending, that's based on the revenue projection we provided the other day. All the numbers together, including income tax, property tax, and what we discussed the other day, come to a total bottom line growth of 3.2% for FY17 compared to 16 budget level. 3.2% is a recovery from FY15, which we only have a little more than 2% increase that year, primarily because of one-time loss from the revenue from income tax there. But 3.2% is due historically levels relatively on the lower end compared to what we experienced in the past. But we're confident that 3.2% is achievable, partly because that we are seeing income tax shows some recovery already, as we just talked about there. Property tax is a slow, a steady growth of over 3% based on the state's number, and that's our number one revenue source. So you have property tax over 3%, income tax shows some recovery, everything else in general has a very minor growth or flat. In total, we have 3.2%. At this point, I'm comfortable with that projection, and that's the amount I showed you
When you say the tax recovery, so property taxes, which is about 50%, 40%.
Fifty.
50% is 3%.
Either one and 3%.
And then the income tax is, you're saying some recovery?
Yeah, it's about 4%.
4%.
Yeah, 4%.
So that's, and then we have 10% is flat, relatively
The
flat.
rest of them is relatively flat.
So you have 90, you basically have 90% times 3.5%,
Right.
which is.
That's why, and then you
That's
take
the
out,
That's where you get the.
yeah, and then you take out some one-time revenues, non-recurring revenue we got in FY16, you remove that from 17 days on it, or top of the property sales there, and then you come up to the total of 3.2%, which is lower than a normal year, but still represents recovery from the prior year.
Okay, open for discussion.
Our recommendation is in the form of a percentage,
It's a percentage.
and what did we recommend last year?
We recommend it.
Oh, last year is very little gross, because
I'm trying to remember off the top of my head what the number was.
Because FY16 compared to 15, if you recall, the budget level is certain amount, and then revenue has a shortfall compared to original budget. So when you recover a little bit from the actual FY15, but compared to budget, it's really minimum growth at that point. I think it's 1.2% at that point. And later, we get some one-time money from property sales, which we were not aware of when we met at that point. And once you add that part, that's very close to the final number.
I'll put, when we send this out.
1.5 or something,
I think
very
we'll-
small growth last year, but by 6.
I mean, in my silly head, 3.2 is pretty robust. You know, the way the world's been in terms of inflation.
1.5 was last year.
Last year, the same.
Does 4% on income tax include capital gain projections, or you just kind of?
We talked about the capital gains, we sort of,
We were
Try
assuming,
not to
we were
project.
assuming capital gains to be flat,
The
zero
same as
gain.
what?
Yeah, same as with last year, 0% growth, because it's really hard to predict.
No, I know.
and it lags too.
Yeah,
It lags. I mean, all the income tax lag.
yeah.
And that's it.
I mean, that's a good point. I mean, 3-point-some percentage for some other county or cities, that's probably a very good growth.
Well, it's above inflation, I mean, in terms of what we think.
And that's why, I mean, I kind of made a point earlier that, you know, we need to figure out a way to live with the 3.2% to 3-point-some percentage there. 'Cause there are always going to be huge demands, but in reality, how much growth you could expect?
Which is how you have to start. Well, typically, again, the business people in the room would say, okay, you've got a budget, you have priorities, and then you start looking back where you reallocate, where you're spending money. That's an act, and the else, either non-governmental, where that's what you start doing.
This percentage of total revenue looks kind of,
It's
Oh.
very,
Very small.
very small.
Among income tax, about 3% is pure capital gains, another 2% is like dividends, interest, and tax.
So I'm not a good out, how much of that
So
overall?
5% of.
5% of income tax,
5% of 40.
Which is 40.
so
5%
that's
of 40 is about 2%.
of the total.
Thoughts? Steve?
Well, just dovetailing off of your thought about looking at it as like you would a business. You know, you look at other counties like reading here on slide Anne Arundel in Baltimore, it's just a simple spending growth equals, well, they use personal income growth, you know, use a different measure, but it seems to me what they're saying is, we're not gonna spend what we're not getting in. You know, we have this much coming in, it's this much growth, so that's how much our spending growth is gonna be, it's a straight line number. Do we wanna consider going towards something like that, you know, with whatever measure we wanna use? Instead of playing around with numbers every year, just say, you know what? Whatever our projected growth is, as far as revenue, that's it. At least as a baseline.
Well, what you get into, depending on who's sitting in that chair, is what that projection is relative to the metrics that they're looking at. And reasonable people can agree or disagree on that type. I think the process that Holly has taken is appropriate don't know that you would want to make anything so programmatic. I'd ask you and maybe Richard whether you want it to be so programmatic that it locks you in versus looking at, because we're actually looking at trends that Richard's putting in. Richard's got one trend, Maryland Economic, it's got another trend. So we look at somewhere, I think we're looking somewhere in between those two things on that part of the thing. I think if you get real prescriptive.
Yeah, if you rely, you said they rely on personal income projections?
That's what the measure they use.
But that would be an incredibly imprecise measure. We would, because 50% comes from property taxes, and property taxes are delinked from personal income in the short term. So it would be an incredibly poor measure, so I'm surprised they use it.
Right. And I'm not saying.
I'm not saying we should.
use that. Yeah, absolutely not.
So I think what we have to do is what we're doing here. So they would be predicting more, and plus, as you point out, Holly and I disagree. I was more optimistic than Holly.
Which we're still dealing with.
So.
Yeah, I agree with Dr. French was saying that if you do a pure formula-driven type, I mean, it has its own value, but might be too limited, given the two major revenue that's driven by different reasons. And also in reality, I think what the committee currently doing is look at everything and then try to take a cautious, realistic, but a little bit towards conservative approach on that. I think that's kind of probably a better way to try to capture those factors.
What we do, listen, nothing's gonna be perfect, but I'd rather err on the side of not having a $14 million structural deficit for the county executive to deal with versus the other one. Nope.
No, it was just from looking at it at 3.2, that's considered, from your point of view, as a conservative estimate, right?
Yeah, to be honest with you, what we're trying to do is not to be overly conservative,
True.
but try to do like a little bit more of a prudent approach. So in other words, if you want to bet like the risk of getting better versus lower than the number, it's more getting better than getting lower. But it's not like overly say, oh, we intentionally try beating whatever 10 million to 15 million, the number that's not. We try to look at all the risks, but more go through the more prudent approach. And that's they call it a recommended best practice on budgeting and revenue.
What's the 3.2 equate to in dollars?
I think $32.7 million.
How much?
$32.7 million. So we have roughly $1 billion.
And how much is maintenance, how much is the maintenance ever increase? Just so-
10.9 million.
So that's 32 million, 10.9 is already spoken for. So you got 20. Just to keep people reflecting on what we're talking about here.
We also have, my impression is that we're likely to have more future demands on pay-go than we have in the past, with the road resurfacing changes that happened last year, and depending on, I mean, this is not our problem, I'm just noting as a fact, this is a political issue, but what they do with the rain tax and how much money needs to be put aside. But I mean, it seems to me that there's things that may require pay-go going forward that.
Yeah, I last year when we were in a much different situation, just because I didn't put anything in there on rain tax because that's an allocation. No, I mean, that's a political issue relative to where the money comes from, and I just want us to keep out of that.
I guess my intent, I shouldn't have brought that up, my intent was to say that the needs for pay-go are not as, my impression is that the needs for, the pay-go will have practical needs more so going forward than they have historically. So we're not, if we ended up with $10 million, there's plenty we could do with it.
I would say, just for this room, my comment, if you got 20 million left, okay, and you've got, how much is going to rain taxes, about 10.some million in revenues? 12, and we've actually, if I recall from talking to Jim Caldwell way back, we probably, that was, the council and county executive, that was a compromise back then, that's underfunded.
Right.
To start with, that, I understand the policy, but I wouldn't touch it right now based on the revenue things that we're seeing. That's, okay, if anyone asks, Okay,
Well, Steve, is that something we should address? Because, I mean, I was prepared to not even talk about it because there was legislation going in and Councilman Fox and the county executive was working on things. But that's been tabled, so it's pretty much it's just sitting there doing nothing right now. So would it not be a good idea for us to say, you might want to just pull that thing off the table and bury it for another year?
I don't know that doesn't, but we said it last year because, we said it last year in the context, we can talk about it, let's get to 3.2%. Because I'm looking at the clock and we're gonna run a little bit late, but let's get to 3.2%. Are we, is that, we have a consensus on that?
Yes.
The minority report?
Yeah.
Okay, so we got 3.2% on that. And I'm gonna just hold off on that because the other thing that we did last year was we did a transfer tax. What we said was the transfer tax, that we would add 50 basis points on it, and that would leverage additional construction spending. And Holly and I have had the discussion as to whether, sort of what's the unintended consequences of doing that relative to debt service and downstream. Does it really, by spending that, does it really help? Or should that just remain in the process of what capital, what capital is allocated within the county? And if you can articulate that to the group a bit more your concern, because last year we didn't have the concern, and we put it in, and the idea was that we could leverage about 17 million, was it, or 17, 20 million in additional construction costs.
At the check number, we have the reaction to that.
Okay.
But the point that, is we're talking about, if you have that base increase, obviously you're gonna have more revenues on that, and I'll find the data quickly on that, and then give you more bonding authority, ability on that, holding everything else the same. But, when we were discussing the other day with Steve, the point I'm making is that whatever you do, that revenue is a drop in the bucket compared to the overall revenue. So when you look at your overall needs and overall debt indicators, what is changed, it's like if you say using that to improve your debt indicators, 3 of the 4 indicators, you're not going to change it at all because that's not even tied to the revenue. The one that tied to revenue is based on general fund revenue, fire tax, and another fund that supported that. And this adding the team relevant to the total is not going to improve that percentage at all. But also it getting the base one time. But the issue when you talk about, no matter it's for operating budget or debt service, CFP, we will talk about the growth issue. Annual base, we're talking 3-point-some percentage growth for a while. So yeah, it might be for one time you can like sponsor some project there, but then once you get in the base, it's still subject to that small growth every year. That's not going to solve the true issue we've been talking today, how to live within a trend or new norm of 3-point-some percentage of growth there. So, and again, it's a policy discussion, for the group and whatever elected officials to decide whether to go that route. But what I try to say, using that, try to solve the issue, it's not the fundamental approach,
Yeah.
right?
And the perspective last year was that, because I agree it won't solve the issue, but the perspective was that it allocated the cost to where the exposure was in a more realistic way, rather than new per se, which it was, well, might be impacted by it, except for new home. I think there's an exception for.
Well, first time buyer, I'm horribly opposed to transfer.
I know you are. I know you. You were on the record last time.
13 million.
It's 13 million in revenue, and then the 13 million in revenue, it equated to how much in borrowing?
If we have $13 million each year in the next 20 years here, it could be, I think, 160 million, something like that. You should do about that. Then that's using next 20 years of revenue to pay the debt service.
So that's, yeah.
Holly, you had mentioned those unexpected revenue from property sales last year. Was that from transfer taxes?
No, that's just,
That was probably another
There were
side.
buildings that were built by the county.
Oh,
That's
okay.
all.
Okay.
we dismissed that property, which is no longer adequate for public usage, so we
Okay.
sell that. That's a one-time thing.
Okay. So let me open up on transfer tax on the thoughts of the committee. So you've heard from a standpoint is, it's, from a long-term standpoint, you've heard it, maybe it isn't the best way to approach it, but it gives you $117 million of construction in education. And we can get around the whole, there's a lot of stuff going right now on
What was the question?
school system. The transfer tax is, do we recommend increasing it 50 basis points, which will leverage to about $100 million over a 20-year period of one-time general obligation bonds payable over the 20-year period. So it would add $100 million to the capacity of education construction.
Which directly impacts on your growth otherwise because of tests in those quarters.
And while there's disagree, you know, because I understand where Bruce is coming from, but the correlation that 67% of the new students are coming from resales.
And that's how you tap it.
And that's why.
I just want to explain my point a little bit
Sure.
further. Number one is in the trenches, the biggest issue in the world since the recession is mortgages. And the biggest issue in mortgages is no more low down payments, no more. So what's the biggest issue facing our biggest group of people? Down payment. And what does this dramatically affect? It affects down payment because it affects closing costs. So the millennials, we want to attract, who are renting like crazy, by doing this, you're telling them to keep renting. And that's really, and also it would put us at the top end of the state for transfer tax.
Yeah, puts us, yes.
We'd be the big.
Transfer.
No, there's nobody at 2.5% total, nobody.
What we looked at.
There's nobody at 2.5%.
Oh, we're lower. We're at 2 now?
Well, there's other,
Well, no, you got transfer, recordation, and all
tax,
that, right.
added them all
Combined,
together.
combined. Okay, that's.
nobody at
okay.
2.5%. They're almost at 2 point something, but they ain't 2.5. Montgomery's at 2 point, nobody's at 2.5.
Baltimore County is a
And our
credit.
income tax.
And we've never been the biggest in anything. Our fees are lower than, so
Yes.
that's why I'm passing.
Baltimore County actually gives a credit for owner occupants, as to incentivize people to buy homes. You know, so that, you know, if we raise, I mean, are we promoting homeownership, or are we gonna promote people to come in to rent apartments or whatever to use the school system? So that's one of the questions
You
that
know,
gets forward to
it's
ask.
silly that we don't put a penny on property tax instead of, look at you. But I know the political guy.
So my recollection from last year was there were no, that we not only made recommendations, but we had discussion points.
Yep.
Not clear recommendations, so I guess without rendering an opinion, because I don't have a strong one on transfer tax, then I would advise probably against it, but, for what it's worth. But having a note in there that an increase in transfer tax would equal some amount of money, to facilitate the discussion, it would at least be consistent. I guess my note would be that that's pretty much what we did last year. It wouldn't represent a substantial change. At a minimum, we should probably do that.
But that accelerates a bunch of projects up front in that bond issuance. The 15, how much, 15, 16, 17 million, whatever? 13 million, and then that equates to 100 million of construction bonds paid over 20 years. In other words, a bunch of projects come on in a very short period of time. That's what that represents. It's
Yeah.
not 13 million, it's not a small amount for the next 20 years come on.
It depends on how you use it.
Right, then
You could do it in a way that.
it'd be
can-
guaranteed that we'd spend it.
Mhm.
And as soon as the money is dragged in, it'll go. So Steve's comment before was not necessarily to connect it to,
Connected on your debt service downstream.
to not automatically go for new projects and fund them all at once. It was to provide additional revenue to do.
It would be.
No, it has to be tied to the new authorization.
Yeah, you already have, it would be basically, you already have unmet needs in the school systems relative to their capital budget plan. So you already have it there. It would be a way for the county
Increase
to
it.
have, to fund some of those things that they
and pay more and fund more.
But it was, but you had direct revenue, the way we're looking at it, you had a direct revenue source to pay for it. And it was being paid for by, in theory, okay, in theory, it was being paid for by the people that were driving most of the increase in student count.
Which is new
Well,
sales
you know,
and
the
resales.
bolder concept of the recommendation thrown on the property tax, whether it's politically nice or not, should still be a concept.
And how, that strikes me, that the notion that 1 penny in property tax
It's
increase.
$11 million, what's $11 million for a penny?
That fact belongs in there, I think, right?
I think we did it last year.
Yeah, we did. We
Say
mentioned
what
property
an increase would be. But correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the other things about the transfer tax was not just the increase, but to talk about the way that's allocated and to look at whether that allocation remains appropriate.
That's
as it
another,
is.
Well,
that's
I'm just
another
saying, that's
Yeah.
another
recommendation.
piece.
That was the next
of it.
bullet on the list, which I think we absolutely need to put in,
That's
whether we
another-
recommend it or not.
That's a very valid point.
Yeah, I just wanted to remember.
But yeah, it was in the email,
It was in the email that went out.
absolutely.
Yeah.
It's in the email that went
Yep.
out, that's still,
Okay,
that's,
I just wanted to remind us that the
Yep.
transfer
That's
tax
a
question
separate-
has two
Right,
pieces to
and
it.
that would, I think, skipping ahead needs to be in, no matter what we recommend as far as whether or not to do it.
but stronger that we were definitely recommending it being, because it's legislation, it's got to go
Absolutely.
down
Yeah.
to the state delegates.
Yes.
through.
Yes,
And so I agree.
I think property tax is 1 cent is about 4.8, 4.9.
Okay, and versus, and the 50 basis points is.
The only thing that
Yes.
is fully funded.
And also, I think, and also property tax rate in the county is relatively, it's on the high end among most counties, if you include a fire tax, which is also.
So what the conversation here was just, if you look at it on an increase in property tax, first of all, to do the 50 basis points in property tax, we got 3 cents on the property tax, and what Holly's saying is we're already, sort of like your comment too, we're already sort of on the high end of property tax. And politically, well, the realtors are gonna be, there's gonna be a lot of groups against it, but politically, to me, whether we do it or not, to me, I like to link things to where I think the exposure is, because at least it's common sense to me, that if people are coming to, everyone says people come to the county because of the education. Well, then to some degree, you should pay for it, relative, because what we're doing with that 1,100 people or 900, 1,100 people a year, we're seeing the impact on our operating cost and capital cost. And it's crazy to say, well, it's all free. Well, it isn't all free. We gotta figure out how to deal with it, whether it's a transfer tax or property tax, someone's gotta pay for it, it's not free. So it's how you do that, as well as, and now it's in the room, pushing back at the, different thing, pushing back at the public school system, saying you gotta look at how you spend your money. Yeah.
Two things. On the transfer tax, in Maryland, it's normal customary to split that equally. So
Yeah.
if you have a senior that's selling their house to move into senior housing or somewhere, they're actually, also sharing that cost.
Mhm.
The other thing is, I wasn't saying anything, but, let me get back to that. I was trying to thought on that, because that was
You're not
important.
as old as me, are you?
Oh, the other thing, oh yeah,
Oh, you got
I
it,
feel like
you got
you
it.
probably have kids.
He's
at home.
younger,
So,
he's younger.
there you go, yes,
Yeah.
have a sleep.
yeah, no stuff in a while. Yeah, I'll get back to the other thing. Oh, no, affordable housing. So I've been approached by council members for years about affordable housing and how can we get the workforce housing in Howard County to live in Howard County. Well, this type of housing that we're talking about in the median income range, that's who it's going to affect the most. Because when we're talking about affordable housing and how can we move people that work in the county live in it, it's like, well, what's the cost to purchase? If you add 0.5%, which typically on new construction, the buyer picks up, the cost, the total cost of the transfer tax. Because the builder's already paid for development fees and for them to record the deed and their building permit. So that buyer is going to affect, that's who's going to pick.
So let me cut to the chase on that. So what that is, it's a 0.5%, the median house is 400, that is which is not what you'd be talking for, it's $400,000. So a 0.5% on that is $2,000. So that's from, I'm just getting down, so from a down payment, that has an impact if it's 20% down payment, 10% down payment, it's $200. If it's 20% down payment, it's $400. and the amount is amortized over 30 years.
Well, the
No,
down
it's
payment's
upfront
not
cost.
accurate, you gotta pay that.
I think that's the question we ran into last year. Hey, Steve,
Have your
that's just
Pay
the
that.
point we ran into last year. Is it an upfront cost or is it really amortized over 30 years?
It's upfront, it's closing costs.
Because it's a closing.
Yeah,
So,
so you have
remember last
teachers,
year we were saying,
fire,
well,
police, that's a lot of money.
You're right.
And I think that was the point last year, Steve, we were talking about, we were saying, well, you know, it's amortized over 30 years, so what's
It's
the
not.
actual cost? But if it's an upfront, that's a whole different
But we're-
ballgame because
But we're talking about revenue from one source versus another, upfront versus over the lifetime of your house, over the lifetime of your mortgage. So if we're talking about a transfer tax versus a 3% increase in property taxes, the effect is when it gets paid, by whom. But everybody's gonna pay
Everybody's
it.
gonna pay it.
Everybody's gonna, those low income,
Either one of
the
those
affordable
things
housing
is
is gonna pay that money over time and increase property taxes if we don't do it.
So you come into the county, you buy a condo, you get a larger family, you buy a larger home, you pay transfer tax, and you get older, you go buy, you know, maybe go back down to another condo, and then you sell your condo to move into senior housing. Now, how many times do you pay that transfer tax?
But
Yeah,
how many
that's-
times do we
every
pay
time
any
anyway.
other tax?
How many
I mean, this is the.
You pay every tax every year.
We pay the other tax every year on the thing.
I mean, real estate is an ATM machine, so it's like, where do you, you know,
Yeah, but this is
impact,
what,
and then the impact
You
tax.
pay the
really
fees, you
does,
pay
yeah.
everything every time you do that. I
but the
mean,
logic is we have an attractive county school that attracts people into the thing. It's not the new housing like it was 10 years ago that's generating the student load, it's the resales. So again, the logic is impeccable of leaning on the people that are causing the cost and capital to go up to pay that cost of capital.
And that's the property tax.
Some
so,
small
yeah.
fraction.
I disagree with the real truth of this in my mind is the same thing that we see all the time. The people that are already here didn't pay it. They didn't pay it. And so we want to charge the new people for the problem.
Well, that's it.
Well, that's my objection.
well, that sounds like what you guys are doing over at APFO with that fee you're putting on homeowners, which
Okay, right now,
That's the
where I
same
am-
issue,
Right.
is that share the burden.
right now where I am is we don't have consensus on it, which is okay. We don't have consensus on it, and that's a decision into itself. I think we can talk about the discussion that we had, but we didn't get consensus on it. And, you know, my view outside of this is, at some point, somebody's got to pay for it. So it's a question of how you pay for it, and no matter what you do, some people aren't gonna like it. So,
I think it's appropriate to say that we consider two additional revenue
Yeah.
sources, and one is transfer tax and one is the increase in the property tax. I mean, that's something they're gonna have to
no,
wrestle
we
with.
can talk about it, but it's not a recommendation, it's part of our discussion.
You're certainly right that we didn't reach consensus on this, but that was not for lack of caring. There are strongly held opinions.
No, I don't think it's bad that we've done that, but I don't wanna push through something where we, you know, typically if it was a board, I'd say 4-3 is unanimous. Okay, that's the way I run a board, but this isn't a board, and we're not gonna do that, so my sense is there's enough discussion here that shouldn't be pushed through as something we're recommending.
We want to say we were.
We were part of the discussion.
So we're just saying that was a discussion.
So the discussion point, I can amplify what we talked about, but there's a lot of, and that goes to what we think should be happening within the county. Rather than the stuff that happens, not in this county, of course, but in politics in general, where it's talking about people, that there should be a discussion about the pros and cons, and there should be a deeper discussion of the people.
Just a recommendation was one that the county consider acceleration of capital projects where the school system are funded by these resources. That's
My own view, if you did it by a transfer tax, it would be acceleration. When you, I think the reality is when you get increasing property tax, it's a different discussion.
Goes in the general fund, that's the
It's a
challenge.
different discussion, and once it's in the general fund, you don't know how it's
You don't
going to
know if you're
spend.
gonna get
But
capital.
we're recommending sooner more capital projects is the recommendation, and there's some way to fund that. We've said that this is a good thing, and that sounds like politics to me, but that's a good thing, just push projects up early and get them done, and now pay for them somehow.
Well, what we're really saying, Dwight, is there's clearly, and I pay attention to Bellwood, there's clearly capital needs in the school system based on
On
the
enrollment.
count. There may be other ways to address it, but there, you know, other things you might do, but I heard fairly comfortably that they looked at, utilization and moving people around. So I was pretty comfortable in that I heard that there was enough discussion on that. So there's an unmet need there, which means we're just gonna push it out because we don't have the funds for it, which means we're gonna have to deal with it with crowding or other ways. And so that's what it would be accelerating, addressing the unmet need. And my own view, unless it's on a transfer tax, which has got a lot of warts on it, unless it's on a transfer tax, it's not gonna be on a property tax increase. It
Or
would have-
some other fee
Yeah, or some,
specifically funds.
yeah.
It really is,
Part of
so,
it, for
so either
typical tax
new people or you go with the
that's
shared
your
payment you
income
guys
tax,
talked
property
about.
tax, you already
It's really-
60% of that is contributing to the school system.
Yeah, and that's, again, it is, we always deal with it, it's political. and
Well, it's political, you're right, it's some part of your ACO thing, but it also it also goes against the, well, it forces the school system to look at different ways to do it, because if you're gonna do it, you know, I hear what you're saying, but I think what they did before, when Jim was the county executive, is it was poor, well, however it was poorly handled, it ended up, the delegation wouldn't support it. And it ended up going back to you guys, by the way,
In
to
the
new
new
homes
home tax.
only.
Yeah.
It went back as a ridiculously increase to new homes only, which begs the logic
Yep.
of why they did that. So, I mean, I always say to home builders, be careful what you ask for.
I know, we supported rate tax.
I know, but I'm saying, you know, because it could,
Because it was.
because in politics where there's no control, you're an easy picking right there, as John Stark always tells me, but you guys are easy picking, and you can see that it coming all back there at some point, because it's a political system.
This is I guess more of a Maryland, state of Maryland related question. And that is, I think I know the answer to it, but just from a purely comparison perspective. So in Georgia, one of the things you can have, and a lot of jurisdictions have, is what's referred to as either SPLOST or LOS. Basically, it's a special local option sales tax. And basically, you may add 1 cent to your sales tax, and that 1 cent goes and funds construction on schools. And so, is there something like that in this, just in the state of
Whether you could, the politics of that, doing that in Howard County, it would be like you hear, because we're a postage stamp, you hear from every retailer and everyone that, well, they're just gonna go 5 miles and not pay that. It would just, you know, if it was if it was city of Atlanta, if it was even Macon or something really big, you could do it, but when you're into it, the whole view about busing people versus building schools. We spent a lot of money on bricks and sticks. Gas was a lot less expensive, and we get the same education. And anyway, that's another.
I don't think it's allowed, but. I
Well,
would-
you have to have an access for it, and you would only be able to build there. I mean, and that's the reason why.
well,
they
and
went
that's
to
the thing, and I guess it's not as quite as controversial, because take the metro Atlanta area. 5 or 6 counties that all abut each other are all doing it, and you actually have a project list that specifically says that, you know, this school is being built in this place, or this HVAC is being replaced. I mean, so part of it, as you were just touching on, there is a specific project list that you can see for each fiscal year. And so in essence, the school systems end up having kind of their, you know, obviously operating, but then they have in many respects, a construction budget that's probably just as big as their operating budget, because it's coming from a dedicated source. That the selling part being that if I'm from Maryland and I go back home and shop, I'm ultimately supporting schools, whether I shop in Fulton, Gwinnett, Cobb, Clayton, DeKalb, because if I buy something, some little sliver of that is going back. But just thought I'd ask that question.
I think it would be difficult.
Yeah.
Well, the key thing you said is you have all these kinds of Atlanta all getting along with this. And, Larry would probably jump all over this and say, yeah, Anne Arundel County would throw that up on a billboard in a heartbeat, you know, come down here, guess what, we don't have one of these.
Well, in order to do that,
So
requires
Prince
state
George's County.
legislation. Requires state
And that's why I said this
legislation,
is more
which
of a
has
Maryland question as
Yeah, it's a
opposed
Maryland
to.
Okay, I'm gonna
Sorry, Steve.
speed this up a little bit so we can get out of here. So the transfer tax we dealt with, we're gonna add, and we'll get it out there, but the recommendation that we sort of brought forward last year, and I want it tougher and harder relative to that we very specifically recommend that the county executive ask the delegation to support legislation that requires a quarterly or every 4 years, a complete review of both sources of funds and uses for each transfer tax bucket. So that can be done on a regular basis. The ambulance fee, that was a great discussion last week, and I think the recommendation is a little bit different than last year, is we recommend that there be a study. We're gonna reach out, we'll talk about this in the small group, but that study include the right people at the table that can answer the questions that come up, including how you recover from insurance companies, so we know all those pieces, and how we deal with the safety net. So that those, and that ties back into billing, too, so how we deal with that relative to billing. So we deal with all those issues. I thought they were good points brought up, and it's the right way to start the process. We can't guarantee someone will do that, but the recommendation will be to study. And that'll include the hospital, nonprofit, someone from the insurance industry, the fire department. So we have all the people at the table, and we're trying to address all the issues and see if it makes sense. The OPEB, I've already said what I think we want to do there is make sure that we're clear that we don't want that fund rated. And the money that's in there.
It is a trust.
Well, I don't mean that, I mean within the budget,
Well, then you love the transportation.
Within the budget year. And that I'm gonna apologize if we weren't clear on that last year. Taking responsibility.
Steve, are we gonna I think what we recommend though is, maybe I misunderstood, are we saying we should not do these extra funds that they talk about, if there's money left over?
That's pay-go. All we're saying, no, pay-go can go in there. We're saying that if it's at the rate they have it, my understanding, that if it's funded without any additional funds, 2021, they'll be fully funded.
Right.
The pay-go helped to accelerate that process. I don't want to tell the county how to spend their pay-go. All we're saying on the pay-go is that we're saying what you have in excess, that you should only spend 50% of that in that fund year and carry it over so that so you don't get left with a year we have nothing. Okay, I think that's what we were recommending. Okay, make sense? And that's the pay-go. We've already said on the CIP, we're going to build that into the borrowing. And multi-year, and we're going to put a recommendation that extends to operating budgets too. We want to see more multi-year budgets as well as capital, so that there's looking out projections. So and I guess the operative term would be realistic projections. And then I think we'll comment on the longer term demographics, because that was part of something that I think the council probably, Alan's probably heard it flowing up. And we brought in some of those people to talk to us about it, but I think we want to make sure the council is as much as anything is sort of starting to get their hands around what's going on here, because it impacts spending and borrowing. Now let's go to the rainy day fund, which we haven't hit, and let's just open it up to what you would like. Last year, what we said was that we said that the rainy day fund, that we recommended that nothing be done to the fee last year because we thought, because we were in a rain tax.
You said
I'm
rainy
sorry, I
day.
said
I
rain
was
tax.
wondering.
I didn't know we made a recommendation on
I was
it.
just listening, I was just listening to the
Rainy day
table.
fund.
That's why we have a committee. Correct? It's, the rain tax. And last year we recommended that rain tax, that there wasn't money in the general fund to be playing with that, and that you just leave it, that it was basically, I think we may have said it was underfunded now.
Yeah.
It's dealt with.
Well, I think because, as I was saying earlier, we do have, in my mind, an opportunity to comment on it. I was prepared not to comment on it because it was in the form of legislation, and I assumed at this point it was gonna be dealt with in one way or the other, but it's not at this point. I think we should make a recommendation to the county executive so that he can consider whether or not to have that legislation pulled. And looking at the numbers, I think that should be the recommendation, that he not move forward with this idea of eliminating the fee. I mean, the numbers don't lie. They say we have what, after we go through MOE, we have $20 million. So can we really afford to suck up 12 of it?
Or if actually what he was looking for was probably half of that, what was he asking?
Yeah, I don't think he's ever really, because that's, didn't see where he actually put out any sort of financial plan.
I would suggest to us that we do a more general comment than rather than pulling legislation. I
Yeah, we
don't
have to
think
meet
that's,
our
I think that puts us in the middle of where we
Okay.
want to be.
Well,
We have to meet the
I was gonna
obligation.
say, I think that in our recommendations, before we make a recommendation even, we need to frame the debate, because we are not political. I realize this is incredibly political, but we are supposedly not political.
sure.
And my concern is that there is a fundamental misunderstanding
What it is.
of what the rain tax is, whether or not these are required expenditures, regardless of whether there's
They
a
are
rain tax.
required.
No, I mean, I
The
understand that.
people don't
No,
understand.
but I don't think people understand that, you know, and to some level.
We can help frame that.
Yes, we need to frame that,
Well-
and we need to frame, and the reality of the issue is who pays for it? Does it come out of the general fund, or does it come out of a dedicated revenue source that's more user-based? I mean, regardless of the politics of it, it has to be paid for. And I think that one of the problems is that there is a discussion going on, including, ironically, my townhouse community sent out a stop the rain tax, you know, you don't wanna pay more on your taxes.
Oh my
Well, guess what? In my townhouse community, if it's coming out of the general fund, it's coming out of our pockets rather
Right.
than if
Out of
there's.
those big people.
Exactly, the large landowners. So there's that lack of understanding.
Well, there was a lack, I watched the hearings.
Yeah.
I found it great late night viewing. And the lack of understanding, even by council members saying, well, what are you gonna take out? Well, the county executive can't take anything out, he's got this, you know, that money has to be expended, that is a state requirement, I guess a federal would agree. There are lots of issues.
Federal tax.
Yeah,
It's
there's,
the EPA that created this.
It's an EPA
yeah,
requirement,
there's
we
lots of
absolutely have to
issues
do that.
relative
So we have to
to,
do these things.
relative to
right,
applicability and whether we can do it, but you're right, so that it is, and I would tell you, when I was on the
Right.
transition team, I met with Jim Caldwell, who was not appointed at that point, and now ended up appointing. It was clear that politically, both sides have done a crappy job of not just talking to people before it became a political issue.
Yeah.
So, and that goes all the way back to when Ken created that committee. It's right in there that this is what you should be doing, but no one did it because it became, well, we got the committee and.
But to that point, I think, and I was trying to be a little nicer about this, you know, part of what we should be doing is not just, I mean, we should be calling, you know, the council and the executive, I don't care how they feel about the rain tax, but to at least discuss the fact that there are certain obligations that this county must meet, regardless, full stop. And the only question is, how do we pay for it? It's not, are we taxed more, are we taxed less? It's how do we pay for it?
Because the same amount of money has to be generated.
Exactly.
And the questions, so from my perspective, the questions floating around that issue, you know, are that it's how it's, where is the burden gonna go? Is it distributed like the rain, I mean, part of like, if it comes out of the general fund, then it is what it is. We don't know how that's distributed. If it's gonna be disproportionately laid on residents, if it's gonna be disproportionately laid on commercial. But more than anything, you know, as we discussed last year, there's other possible revenue sources, and the ag price
Yeah.
rolling off. And I think that there's things that we can do in terms of saying we have to meet the requirement, but if we don't like the rain tax and we wanna roll it off, like there's some negotiating points that I think the council has to work through that we don't wanna prescribe what the answer is, but like, for instance, framing it so that we could have a slower roll-off if they wanna get rid of it, so that we can get into the money on the fund balance and the ag pres fund, like, having some sort of a nuance in the way that we express where the money might come from, but that we have to pay it, I think opens up the communication, instead of, it's not a, do we eliminate it tomorrow or not? There's a,
No, I agree with you, but
I think, Nina, I think you're on spot. Let's take a cut at that and really open the because I think you start with, clearly the committee understands it is something that has to be paid for. Okay, we start with, it's an obligation, whether we like it or not, whether it's the right, whether EPA's done it, it doesn't really matter at this point.
Well, actually, it was the state's reaction to the.
It was everybody.
Because everybody, other states didn't necessarily take this approach.
But again, that's the framing, it really is from a financial standpoint of, we have this obligation, here's how much it is, and
Well,
we get
But
the
that's not
funding
in the
sources and
charge
all
of
that,
our-
we take that out.
But I think that's not in the charge of our committee. I mean, everyone has their own opinions about, runoff, the bay, whatever.
Right,
But
that's why
the
I
charge
make
of
it
this committee is how, spending and affordability. And it is what it is.
we have a liability.
Yes.
Right.
It's an
Yeah,
obligation.
exactly. It is what it is, whether we want it to be or not.
Right.
And it has to be met, and so if the matter is how does it get met?
Right, so again, we're just gonna basically a financial analysis, and really it really doesn't even need to be so much of a recommendation as a statement of facts. Here's your situation, and then leave it to the politicians to figure out what to do about it. We're just giving them
But maybe we
the
can
numbers.
frame that discussion a little bit better by trying to put some things down
Right.
that lay it out in a
Yeah.
way that
Right.
we've discussed it.
Well, because if you think about it, the discussion should be whether it's, we don't care whether it's general fund, whether it's a utility tax, which it is right now, or whether that utility tax, because be reviewed. And I'll just say, I listened to it, and some people in here testify, but I listened to it, and I heard Jen kept asking, have you applied for the tax credit? And it's bullshit. I mean, any business. Why am I gonna do that? Why am I gonna do that unless everybody's doing it and the cost in commercial and shopping centers is passed on to my tenants as can go. It can happen less like I think Cole Schnorf went and said, we're redeveloping. Of course, if we're redeveloping, one, we have to do it if we're redeveloping, and why wouldn't I want the tax credit if we're redeveloping? So the lack of sort of just understanding even among our elected officials, and then much less I agree, much less the public, who just thinks it's a tax that's going into
Because all
a
taxes.
general fund that'll be robbed and not used for anything anyway. I mean, that's the general feel of Donald Trump's people, and
Now,
I would
let's
say
not get
maybe even
political.
Bernie Sanders. Well, I don't know, but it's, at the extremes, that's sort of the feeling on it, and that's not the case. So I think us framing that there should be a deeper look at revenues, at sources of funding.
Yeah.
Not tell them what to do, but
Right.
there's a lot of things you can do. And then the thing when it says, well, you got a lot of different ways you go. I don't know the right way, but clearly, it's, the way it was set up was not the perfect way, because it was by and of itself a compromise that didn't include business people.
Does the utility tax come into the revenue percentage for our debt financing capacity?
No.
So
It doesn't.
keeping it there does not artificially raise our ability to borrow more money?
It's a special fund, but if it ceases to be a specific tax that's coming out of the general fund.
It would.
If in the future we issue a Q bond, then both of them is going to be added into it.
So you're allocating the problem to the source, you want to keep it.
In a separate
This
fund.
is general observation, clearly you're not strongly held opinions on this. But I think one issue on this, the public perception is, what are we doing with the money? What does the public get in return for this? And I don't know that any of those jurisdictions have done a good job of explaining that. If you're paying this tax, what does the tax do, and how does it impact the problem? And, for what it's worth, I mean, I don't think a whole lot of people understand what the outcome is.
Well, it's a lot more luster than there is cost, for at least for residential. For business, it's a bigger issue, because it really, you talk about taxes, it increases your cost of business, and and to reality is, if everyone really wanted to get deep in it, in theory, I'll just talk to a shopping center, you and I would be paying for it when we go in to buy something.
No, it impacts everybody regardless of whether
It's
it
an
comes from
indirect
the
tax.
general fund or. it
People
goes-
don't understand, it's indirect tax on the consumer at the end of the day.
Without regard to their ability to pay, which is always a problem.
So it's a regressive tax.
It is if we could pay at the front end to try and.
Can we talk about
correct the
preventive
problem,
maintenance?
or, we fix the
That's what
problems
it
that
is.
are created. We used to throw the trash into the street, but now we have municipal trash pickup.
I know, it's, the problem is, and I think why I like Nina's suggestion, that we attempt to reframe it in a broader thing of creating conversation. The problem is it wasn't done correctly at the beginning to create the conversation, and that ship has already sailed, and therefore the opinions are already out there as to what it is. It's just a government, another, and they start, I mean, to be honest, they look at the state, they look at the trust funds, the gas, the gas funds, the Chesapeake Bay trust funds, and they see how it got rated and rated and rated,
Pension fund?
and they say, what, they don't trust.
And now we have to.
I mean, it's, and I wouldn't trust either. I don't trust the state government relative to, I stopped giving money to any politicians down there because why, I said, you already get your pay raise, you tax the hell out of me, and there's no accountability for it. It really is. So you know where I stand.
As if we didn't before.
I like education, I just want to make it report. Anyway, so we'll frame that. Any other things that we should be touching on?
As Ryan brought up, the agriculture
Ah.
development rights preservation program. We spent a good amount of time on that last year,
Yeah.
looking at
You
projections.
did it again.
And we looked at it and said, you know, there's potential to remove money from that fund appropriately at a certain time, so that it didn't grow to, I think, 300 million or some ridiculous amount of money that's
Yeah.
gonna continue to go there, and that was the allocation of the transfer.
Right, so
tax.
isn't that part of the review?
That's part of that review.
How did the
We're
review?
saying,
Right.
we're saying,
Before
what
your
we want to
We're now a
do.
year
Yeah, because that's
later.
several years out
No,
before we
no,
start
not,
seeing it.
well, it's two, we can look.
I mean, we're a year
at that,
later,
and
we
can
did
look
not
at that
make that
again.
fund.
It was 2020 that they.
Right,
they
that was
were in
when we were
the
gonna
red
start
for 2
realizing
years.
this.
Not immediately, after a few years, that might be
Yeah, it was
helpful,
about
and
Right.
that might have
2020.
Yeah.
Those numbers,
I agree with it.
those numbers should be recast.
Yes.
We need to
Find
put
out.
that forward strong.
Is it now 2022 that you could possibly go in there, or is that 2018?
Yeah.
We'll recast the agriculture, that's what it was.
And that informs the decisions about the need to review how those funds are allocated anyway.
And it's
And
closer
whether
to-
it's appropriate to take the transfer tax and apply it to a fund, which everybody needs to know.
Well, you know what'll be helpful, Stan, if you recast that and do it line by line, showing what it was this time last year, what it is this year, because if there's a change, it solidifies our reasonable recommendation that you look at funding and spending, sources of funds and what's being
Some
spent.
of the pipeline projects that were unsure have gone forward at this point, so I'll be a little bit more clear.
Okay, so that's a good piece there. What else?
Is it-
Yes,
I know we talked about the ambulance fee, and forgive me, I forget what the name of this other fee is. It's, the police chief had talked about this to cover the expenses,
that was the.
for the
that was
overtime that
fee.
they spend.
With Meriwether,
Yeah.
essentially.
Yeah.
Sounds like they're
They're
moving forward.
working on legislation.
Police fees or
Currently,
whatever.
hasn't pre-filed yet. They're working on legislation to.
So it's already in
to
the
propose
works. Okay,
something
then that's-
related.
It's a moot point at
There,
this
there,
point.
sounds like they're slicing and dicing is similar to
Yeah.
what we recommended,
Okay.
which is appropriate. Okay, so I've got, next steps is, we're gonna do a draft of this, okay, as ugly as it may look. We're gonna do a draft, and Holly, before she heads up to New York to smooth all the fine people, is gonna try to get that out. I'm gonna take a smaller group, people I've talked to, that what I'd like to do is, do two things. Get it out to you, send your comments back to Holly and me, okay, so that group will have those comments when we sit down. And then, I'm gonna talk to them and try to get a good date. I'd like to probably, we had set next Thursday, that was our snow date, but depending on a call that I have Monday, I'll be in Detroit Wednesday and Thursday. So I'm gonna try to see if that group can meet, either early Wednesday morning or sometime Tuesday, to basically take what we've gotten back from you and from Holly and fine tune it. it'll be actually a rough draft report that Holly puts out, and then fine tune it, and then, we'll get it, you know, whatever that small group does that we did last year, we'll get it right back out to you. Then I think, there is it goes to Alan, there's a press conference. I've actually watched it, I look, not quite as old as I do this year. There's a press conference that we have with the press, and then there will be a meeting where I'll take 3 or 4 of you to the county council, where we meet, that's for cover. I wear a Kevlar vest. That went really well. I mean, it was a really good discussion, and I think, you know, it was a good discussion. So we'll go and then meet with the council, and last year what happened, the council asked us to come back when they were doing their capital for a second meeting, which was fine. And I think it's good for them, because in some ways, you know, they got a million things going left and right with constituencies and with legislation, and in some ways we take a deeper look at this than they have a chance. So I thought it was, I think it's helpful. And again, our meeting with both the county executive and the press, and when we meet with the council, is that the key thing that we're listening, and we'll prepare, as we did last year, prepare for the council meeting, but we're listening and, you know, validating people's concerns or issues, but it's really trying to foment a conversation within the county. And, you know, I liken it, listen, I remember the last election campaign, it was the worst thing in my view, just the tone and tenor within this county. And you see what's happening in the country today. And my goal as I go under term is that doesn't happen in Howard County, but the likelihood is more likely to happen than not, as something, as you've heard, flows downhill. And that's what we're seeing, and that doesn't bode well for our community if that's what we become. And so my hope, at least within this group, that more than just making recommendations, that we see that the most important thing they can do is not talk at each other, but start as a community talking with each other. What our recommendations, and I've said it down, we'd be more than happy to get a small group to have town hall meetings to let people ask us questions and deal with it, because I think it would be helpful within the community that we do that people can ask, and we can walk them through the process and how they thought, because I think it's part of democracy, but it's also more importantly part of representative government and people having more sense of what this hell that the county's about, the republic's about, you know. I think I saw, it was a post, I don't post that much on Facebook, there was a post where it was, it was a post, and it was about this guy, someone comes into a bar and is asking for something, and the other person said, you need to don't talk Spanish or whatever, you need to talk English. If you're in this country, you need to talk English. And the person said, I said, well, I'm Navajo, maybe you need to go back to English.
English is spoken in England, you need to go back to
And my point, when I did my post, I said, you know, most of the people reading this, including myself, go back 2 or 3 generations, and that's where we were. I mean, in terms of immigrants in this country. This is my, you know, I'm all for, we need to have better integration and better control, and a lot of things we need to do better. But what's the discussion and where we are politically on this kind of discussion is so out of whack with not just our values, but in terms of solving issues, that it's just isn't. I'm just telling you, it's the only solace I take is getting old is that I'm not happy with the trend line that we're heading in, and we all, within the context of that, and this is outside the scheme, we all have a responsibility to be leaders and to stand up and to talk about those values, but didn't political. It's our values as a people and as a country. It's a fine line between voting on fear and what happens in other countries when fear has been the driver. It's not a very pretty end.
Steve, well, my point, and again, with one of the rating agencies next week, by many measures, we will tell the rating agencies, quite honestly, this is one of the best educated communities in the country. And if not the best, I'd like to say it's the best, but it's certainly. We have a lot of businesses to show that, but one of the best educated communities in the country.
Yeah. And I thank, you know, we'll pull this all together. I thank you all. It's been, as good as last year was, this group's been more engaged, and that goes well. We just gotta push that out beyond these walls. Okay?
Thanks, guys.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Go for it.
Good luck in New York.
Steve, a couple Thursday.